If you were the CEO of a multi-million-dollar business enterprise in the world today, we would expect that you'd be highly respected among your peers and society at large. In Indianapolis back in the 1990s, Herbert Baumeister was that man. He was like the McDonald's of that time. But despite his high social standing, Herbert was a two-faced man, a publicly known astute business tycoon, and a secretly unknown serial killer. Well, if we're talking about having skeletons in the closet, Herbert Baumeister's case is an extraordinary example because this multi-billionaire had 10,000 human bones buried in his property. This is the disturbing case of Herbert Baumeister. In 1996, 10,000 bones were found buried in a horse farm in Herbert's enormous mansion in suburban Indianapolis. For many years, Herbert, who many viewed as a model citizen, secretly murdered and buried the bones of his victims in his yard, until luck finally ran out when in 1994, one of his kids stumbled on a skull while playing in their backyard. 2 years later, in 1996, the police discovered what would shock every American. On April 7, 1947, in the little town of Indianapolis, a male child was born to the family of Dr. Herbert Eugene Baumeister, who was an anesthesiologist. His wife, Elizabeth Baumeister Nee Schmidt, had just given birth to their first child. Dr. Baumeister was so glad he decided to name the young child after himself, Herbert. Young Herbert's childhood was at first normal, but soon all that would change for the worse. At the onset of adolescence, Herbert began to exhibit antisocial behavior, which was abnormal for a vibrant teenager full of life. His friends knew him to be a strange boy who always craved absurd things. At times, his urophilia made him ponder what it would be like to taste human urine. Herbert also had this hobby of playing with dead animals, and even in school, he loved urinating on his teachers' desks. The young teenager's weird behavior, however, didn't go unnoticed in the eyes of his father, who was very worried about him, to the extent of taking Herbert to the psychiatric hospital for mental examinations. Medical reports subsequently diagnosed Herbert with paranoid schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder. Though his condition was serious, nothing was done to remedy it, as Herbert did not receive further treatment. Despite attending a school that was known for its great sporting activities, Herbert was a student who wanted no part in the activities because he just didn't blend in. His antisocial and introverted lifestyle made him spend many hours alone, withdrawn from himself and avoiding company. He finished high school in the early 1960s, and though he maintained his grades, he was failing socially. He furthered his education at the University of Indiana in 1965, but after just one semester, he dropped out due to his antisocial behavior. But after his dad mounted pressure, he returned in 1967 to study anatomy, but dropped out yet again before the semester ended. However, while at IU, he met Juliana Sater, a high school journalism teacher and part-time student, and they began dating. Unable to continue with academics, he dropped out and started searching for a job. His dad found him as a paperboy at the Indianapolis Star. Though he had a strong work ethic, his behavior was bizarre, and he was labeled a nutcase by colleagues. In November 1971, he married Juliana Sater, but Herbert's marriage was far from blissful. His wife would soon find out that her husband wasn't mentally stable, but blinded by love, she stayed put. The problem started 6 months after their marriage when Baumeister was admitted into a psychiatric hospital by his father for 2 months because he was hurting and needed help. In 1988, Baumeister founded the Save-A-Lot thrift store chain in Indianapolis, and soon he was a rich man. In May of that same year, the couple purchased a Fox Hollow farm property for residential purposes. During the time Herbert bought the farm property in 1988, the city of Indiana was experiencing high rates of mortality, especially among young men. An unknown serial killer nicknamed the I-70 Strangler was responsible for killing over 11 young men and boys and dumping their dead bodies all over Indiana and Ohio, a series of killings that took place between June 1980 and October 1991. Though the police were investigating the case, they couldn't come up with anything tangible. However, that was about to change at the dawn of the 1990s. 9 years after getting married to Juliana, Herbert had his first child, a girl named Marie, who was born in 1979. 2 years later, in 1981, a son named Eric followed, and then finally another daughter, Emily, was born in 1984. Though Herbert was jobless during that period, he was a caring father to his kids. But just as he bounced back on his feet with the establishment of the thrift stores, his father died. It's not known what impact this may have had on him, but given how supportive his father was to him, it must have been a tough pill to swallow for Herbert. However, he may have put that aside, as soon after the success of his first business venture, he bought the Fox Farm house. 3 years after buying this house, he moved in with his family to the 18-acre mansion in 1991. The large, beautiful million-dollar semi-mansion had all the luxuries you could think of, including bells and whistles, a massive horse ranch, and an indoor pool. Herbert had become a well-respected man who donated to numerous charities. But even though the Save-A-Lot thrift stores had a reputation for being clean and organized, the same could not be said about Herbert's new home. The once meticulously maintained ground quickly became overgrown with weeds because Herbert only seemed to care about the pool area. He kept the wet bar stocked and filled the area with extravagant decor, including mannequins that he dressed and positioned to give the appearance of a lavish pool party. The young man grew increasingly distant from his family, and this made his wife and kids prefer to stay at his mother's Lake Wawasee condominium. Herbert gave his family the excuse of always being so busy with work and running the stores that he barely had time for them. But while they visited his mom on summer vacations, Herbert was hanging out at local gay bars. His wife never knew about this. However, it wasn't too long before something mysterious happened that raised questions in Juliana's mind. In 1994, Herbert's 13-year-old son, Eric, was playing in a wooded area behind their home when he found a partially buried human skull. The young lad picked it up and took it to show his mother, who was puzzled at the discovery. A confused Juliana had a lot of questions for her husband, who wasn't home then. When he came back from work, she showed the bones to Herbert, who quickly dismissed her doubts with a rather clever response. He told her that his father had used skeletons in his research, and the young lady unsuspectingly believed him. Herbert then proceeded to have the bones stored in his garage before later taking them out to be buried in the garden in his backyard. Meanwhile, Herbert continued his habitual routine of visiting gay bars at night and also suffered from severe alcohol addiction. Soon enough, his once thriving business began to dwindle gradually, and he would often retreat to his pool house, where he spent hours crying like a child about the dying business. The bills were piling up, and his wife, Juliana, was getting exhausted from worry. She also began to observe that her husband had started acting very strangely with each passing day. This sudden change in habit was also reflected in the business, as he was acting belligerently toward customers and employees alike. During this period of financial and marital crisis, a major murder investigation was underway in Indianapolis. A lot of heinous crimes and killings were discovered, which would, in the end, link to Herbert. It all started in 1977 when Virgil Vandegrift, a highly respected retired Marion County sheriff, opened a private investigation firm in Indianapolis named Vandegrift & Associates Incorporated to tackle the rampant case of missing persons in the state. But it wasn't until June 1994 before Mr. Vandegrift was contacted by the mother of a certain 28-year-old Alan Broussard, who she said was missing. She told the retired sheriff that the last time she saw Alan, he was headed to meet his partner at a popular gay bar called Brothers, but he never returned home. Recall that it was this same year, 1994, that Herbert's son found skeletons in their mansion and reported them to his mom. However, just 1 week after the first missing person was reported to Vandegrift, the retired sheriff received a call from another distraught mother about her missing son. She told Vandegrift that 32-year-old Roger Goodlett had left his parents' home to go to a gay bar in downtown Indianapolis, but he never came back home. Based on the reports from both women, Vandegrift concluded that Broussard and Goodlett, who were both gay and almost the same age, had vanished on their way to the gay bar. He also immediately took action. He distributed missing person posters at gay bars around the city while family members, friends, and customers at gay bars were interviewed. Vandegrift learned that Goodlett was last seen willingly entering a blue car with Ohio plates. At the time, he wasn't sure who owned the car. Not too long after, Vandegrift received another call from a gay magazine publisher who told him that several gay men had disappeared in Indianapolis over the previous few years. At that moment, Vandegrift became convinced that he was dealing with a serial killer, and he tabled his report before the Indianapolis Police Department. But unfortunately, during that time, gay people were treated with low priority. The police gave the excuse that the men must have left home without telling their families to freely practice their gay lifestyles. While interacting with the police, Vandegrift learned about an ongoing investigation into multiple murders of gay men in Ohio that began in 1980 and ended in the early 1990s. The bodies of these dead men were dumped along Interstate 70 and were known as the I-70 murders. Out of the 11 corpses of dead young men discovered, 4 of them were from Indianapolis. They were found strangled and partly unclad in a 3 to 4 block area frequented by gay men in Indianapolis. The unknown serial killer became known in the community as the I-70 Strangler. But it didn't take too long before the identity of this mysterious man was revealed. Several weeks after Vandegrift distributed the missing person posters in gay bars, he was contacted by a young man who claimed to know the mysterious serial killer. The man requested to go by the name Tony for security reasons and told Vandegrift he had spent time with the person responsible for Goodlet's disappearance. The young man told Vandegrift that he had gone to report his case to the police and the FBI, but they ended up disregarding his information. Immediately, Vandegrift set up a series of interviews with Tony. Unknown to him, he was about to listen to one of the most bizarre stories he would ever come across. The interview Vandegrift granted Tony would send shockwaves around the entire country. Tony began by telling Vandegrift that one night while he was at a gay bar, he noticed a certain man who was overly captivated by the missing persons poster of his friend, Roger Goodlet. As he continued to watch from a distance, something in his eyes convinced him that this man possibly had some information about Goodlet's disappearance. To gather information from the man, Tony went closer to introduce himself and started a conversation immediately. There, he learned his new acquaintance was a landscaper from Ohio named Brian Smart. But when Tony brought up Goodlet's topic, Brian Smart became evasive. As the evening progressed, Smart invited Tony to join him for a swim at a house where he was temporarily living, doing landscaping for the new owners who were away. Tony agreed and they drove off in Brian Smart's Buick, which had an Ohio plate number. Although he was not familiar with the northern part of Indianapolis, he described the area as having horse ranches and large homes, despite not being able to state precisely where the house was. He also described seeing a split-rail fence and a sign that read Fox Hollow Farm at the front of the driveway Mr. Smart turned into. The house was a large Tudor home with an entrance through a side door. According to him, the interior of the home was packed with furniture and boxes. He followed Smart through the house and down steps to the bar and pool area, which had mannequins set up around the pool. Smart offered Tony a drink, which he turned down. A few minutes later, Smart excused himself, and when he returned, he was a lot more talkative. Tony suspected that he had snorted cocaine. At some point, Smart brought up autoerotic asphyxiation, asking Tony to try it with him. Tony obliged and choked Smart with a hose while he masturbated. Smart then said it was his turn to do it to Tony. Again, Tony went along, and as Smart began choking him, it became obvious that he was not going to let go. Tony pretended to pass out, and Smart released the hose. When he opened his eyes, Smart became rattled and said he was scared because Tony had passed out. Tony was considerably larger than Smart, which could have been the reason why he survived. Moreover, he refused to take any drinks Smart had offered him earlier in the evening, suspecting that they could have been drugged. After all the supposed fun at the mansion, Smart drove Tony back to Indianapolis, where they agreed to meet again the following week. At this point, Tony came to Vandegrift, and a plan was set up to learn more about Smart. The retired sheriff arranged to have Tony and Smart follow through with their second meeting, but this time around, Smart never showed up. Vandegrift was left with no option but to believe Tony's story, and that led him to the police once again. This time he contacted a reputable detective who worked on cases of missing people in the state. Her name was Mary Wilson, and together they came up with a plan to nail Brian Smart. She drove Tony to the wealthy areas outside Indianapolis, hoping that he might recognize the house that Smart took him to, but nothing came of it. 1 year later, Tony met Smart coincidentally when they happened to stop at the same bar. He was lucky enough to get Brian Smart's license plate number, which he, in turn, gave to Miss Wilson. She found that the plate was registered to Herbert Baumeister and went into thorough research. As she learned more about Herbert Baumeister's history, she agreed with Vandegrift that Tony had narrowly escaped becoming the victim of a serial killer. A few days later, Miss Wilson went to the Save-A-Lot thrift store in Indianapolis to confront Herbert Baumeister all by herself. She told him that he was a suspect in an investigation into several missing men and asked that Herbert allow investigators to search his home. Of course, his response was predictable. Herbert took offense at the detective and told her that, in the future, she should go through his lawyer if she had any questions. Disappointed, Detective Wilson went away, but she wasn't giving up yet. She approached Herbert's wife, Juliana, and told her about the investigation, hoping she could get her to agree to a search. Although Mrs. Baumeister was shocked by what she heard, she also refused. Having failed to make any progress on her own, she turned to the Hamilton County office and tried to get them to issue a search warrant on Herbert's home, but they refused, saying there was not enough conclusive evidence to warrant it. Detective Wilson had to let go at that moment, but she didn't lose interest. Subsequent events revealed that Herbert Baumeister suffered an emotional breakdown for the next 6 months, forcing his wife to contemplate divorce. Their thrift store sponsor, Children's Bureau, had terminated the contract with Save-A-Lot, and she faced bankruptcy. The fairy tale life she lived began to dissipate, as did her loyalty to her husband. To make matters worse, the haunting image of the skeleton that her son had discovered 2 years earlier had not left her mind since she first spoke to Detective Wilson. Juliana went ahead and filed for divorce and told Wilson about the skeleton. She also agreed to allow detectives to search the property without the knowledge of her husband. When her husband and son visited her mother-in-law in Lake Wawasee, Juliana picked up the phone and called her lawyer. Meanwhile, preparations for a thorough investigation by the Hamilton County office were heating up. Soon, the investigations began amid divorce proceedings between Herbert and his wife of 25 years. Juliana was scared of what her husband might do if he found out about what she had just done, so out of panic, she asked for witness protection for her and the kids. Because she and Herbert were in the early stages of their divorce, it was decided that before a full-scale investigation was carried out and the discoveries were broadcast, Herbert should be served with custody papers demanding that Eric be returned to Juliana. Subsequently, Herbert Baumeister turned Eric over without flinching, thinking that it was just legal procedure. Once Juliana had gotten custody of Eric, in addition to her other 2 kids who were already staying with her, authorities gave the signal for a thorough search, which was carried out 3 days later. Investigators barged in while Herbert was away on vacation with his son at his mother's place. Detective Wilson and 3 Hamilton County officers walked onto the grassy area next to the Baumeisters' patio. As they looked closely, they could see that the small rocks and pebbles where the Baumeister children often played were bone fragments. This was later confirmed by forensics. The following day, police and firemen began excavation. Bones were littered everywhere, even on their neighbor's land. The search uncovered about 10,000 bone fragments and teeth. Forensics estimated that the bones were from 11 men, although by that time only 4 victims could be identified. Roger Goodlett, age 33, Stephen Hale, 28, Richard Hamilton, 20, and Manuel Resendez, 34. An arrest warrant was issued for Herbert Baumeister because, immediately after the story of the bones' discovery at his house was broadcast, Herbert Baumeister vanished. Nobody knew his whereabouts until July 3, 1996, when his body was found inside his car in Pinery Park, Ontario County. From all indications, Herbert Baumeister had committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. When his clothes were searched, it was discovered that he left a 3-page suicide note explaining why he took his life. In the suicide note, he cited his reasons for committing suicide as the problems surrounding his failed business and marriage. However, he never made mention of the murder victims scattered across his backyard. If Herbert Baumeister was behind the deaths of these men, it was a secret he took to the grave with him, because by committing suicide, he had taken away the police's ability to solve the murder cases. But the authorities wouldn't relent in their efforts to get justice and identify the victims. Thorough excavations continued, and 3 years later, in 1999, it was announced that Herbert was responsible for the deaths of 9 additional young men in Ohio and western Indiana between 1980 and 1991. With Juliana's help, investigators were able to piece together evidence that linked Herbert Baumeister to the I-70 murders. Finally, the identity of the mysterious I-70 strangler was revealed. Herbert's estranged wife, Juliana, also provided receipts showing that Herbert Baumeister had traveled on I-70 during the times that the bodies were found along the interstate. Another strong piece of evidence that pointed to Herbert's involvement in these murders is that bodies stopped appearing beside the highway when he moved into his 18-acre Fox Hollow Farms. This meant that he was no longer dumping them on the road because he now had plenty of space and land to hide dead bodies on his estate. By the end of 1999, the total number of victims suspected of being killed by Herbert Baumeister was 16, though only 9 of them were identified. As the years passed, more excavation and forensics were carried out in an attempt to provide answers to the families of the dead. In 2022, the newly elected coroner of Hamilton County, Jeff Jellison, vowed to continue with the case, and soon another investigation was launched. To this end, the Hamilton County Coroner's Office enlisted the help of about 10 dogs from Indiana Canine Search and Recovery to search the Fox Farm property. Fortunately, this would yield 2 more IDs for 27-year-old Alan Livingston and 34-year-old Manuel Resendez. However, Manuel Resendez turned out to be among the 8 names whose remains were found during the initial probe in the 1990s. At that point, the total number of I-70 victims had risen to 11. Barely 2 years later, on May 21, 2024, another breakthrough was announced in the victim identification process. DNA had helped to identify a new victim named Jeffrey Jones, who was 31 years old at the time he went missing. Speaking on the discovery, the Hamilton County Coroner, Jeff Jellison, added that Jeffrey Jones had gone missing in 1993 in Indianapolis, at a time when young men vanished between the 80s and 90s. Jeffrey was named as one of Herbert Baumeister's victims. However, the coroner also revealed in an update on the case that the remains on the property could represent at least 25 people. We know that we have at this point found 13 victims on the Fox Hollow Farm property. Because many of the remains were found burned and crushed, this investigation is extremely challenging. However, the team of law enforcement and forensic specialists working on the case remains committed, he added. Mr. Jellison emphasized that more DNA samples were now set to be analyzed, which, according to him, remains the most efficient way that all the victims could be identified. Other confirmed victims include John Lee Johnny Bayer, Richard Douglas Hamilton Jr., Stephen Sperlin Hale, Alan Wayne Broussard, Roger Allen Goodlett, Michael Frederick Mike Kern, and Jerry Williams Comer. All were named after DNA extracted from bones found on Herbert Baumeister's expansive compound. The former home and suspected scene of up to 25 murders still stand today, with eerie images showing the first crime scene search. Cops, meanwhile, have already identified 20 additional locations that might yield more excavations in the currently vacant home, with an additional 3 sets of remains still unidentified. All are believed to be male and the victims of homicide. The Hamilton County Coroner's Office appealed to the public to come forward if relatives went missing during the killer's reign of terror across greater Indianapolis. Also, they have been urged to complete a DNA test as the search effort continues. With that, we call it a wrap on this rather eerie video. We thank you for staying throughout the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.